Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at some of my older reviews and bring them up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Mirror's Edge for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, and what you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a sort of hybrid of first-person action game and first-person platformer developed by DICE and published by EA back in 2008 for consoles and later released in 2009 for PC. And the buzz surrounding it was actually rather positive. This was an untested, brand new IP that was coming out of EA, and EA was not known for anything remotely original at that point, let's put it that way. But all of a sudden, in the late aughts, they decided that it was going to be a good idea to invest in some new IPs, and one of the IPs that came out of that was Mirror's Edge. They also did things with Mass Effect and Dead Space, and those turned out pretty well for them as well. So what happened with Mirror's Edge? Well, it was well received when it came out. Most people seemed to enjoy it quite a bit, and it did eventually get a sequel, but the sequel didn't come out for another 7 years. Well, I say sequel, what I mean is reboot, because that's what Mirror's Edge Catalyst is. But regardless, this thing was well received, and it's actually kind of surprising that DICE didn't revisit it for quite a long time. I guess they just decided it was in their best interest to not revisit something that's actually rather unique and was fairly well received, and instead go, you know what, let's just make more crappy Battlefield games. But I digress. Let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out if it still holds up after almost a decade since its release. Well, the presentation certainly holds up rather well. It runs on Unreal Engine 3 and has a very large amount of detail in just about everything. The modeling is excellent, the texture quality is rather high, and in general the animations are pretty solid. There are a few here and there that look kind of wonky, but for the most part they've done a good job with them. There are, however, two things that will drive you absolutely insane with this game. The first of them is the motion blur, which is rather intense and there's no way to turn it off. The second of them is the bloom lighting, which is very intense and there's no way to turn it off. These both cause problems because the game actually runs at 60 plus frames a second. It doesn't have any need for motion blur at all, so there's really no reason to put it in the game. Unfortunately, they decided to anyway, and since there's no way to turn it off, it actually gets really annoying after a while. But the bloom lighting is considerably worse because it is so intense that it outright blinds you and causes a rather large amount of eye strain. I actually can't play this thing for more than maybe an hour at a time simply because the eye strain becomes so significant that it gives me a headache. Your mileage may vary on that, but luckily there's no issues with FOV because the FOV in this game is 90 degrees. So definitely kudos to them for actually getting that right at least. And as an aside, the game does run extremely well unless you have PhysX enabled. Now, PhysX is a physics simulation software that is actually included with NVIDIA graphics cards these days. The problem is that this isn't built for that, it's built for the PhysX card that was available on its own around the time of the release. And those simply had a different way of handling the PhysX simulation than the graphics cards do. It's a different architecture, and thus they kinda aren't cross-compatible, which causes severe frame rate drops in this thing. And by severe, I mean it goes from basically 60 frames a second down to single digits. And it's completely independent of your actual hardware, so you could have really powerful hardware well beyond what should be able to run this thing at max settings without any problems whatsoever, like for example my rig, and suddenly your frame rate is terrible. Luckily, there is a fix available for it, and I will provide a link in the video description box to where you can check out that fix. Now, if you're wondering how that factors into the review, it kind of doesn't. I don't really count that as a major problem against the game because it was something that came out so long after the game's release. It's not really the game's fault that PhysX got bought out by NVIDIA, and when that happened, they changed the APIs, so now it causes all kinds of issues. Now that said, if you can get PhysX working on compatible games, then it actually does enhance the visuals a fair bit, so that is worth noting. It's particularly good at cloth simulations, which this thing uses to a pretty good effect sometimes. However, if there is one thing I can really easily criticize about the visuals, it is the animated cutscenes. Not the in-game cutscenes, because those are all done fully in the Unreal Engine 3, and of course they're done from a first-person perspective. No, I'm talking about the 2D animated cutscenes that are very highly stylized and frankly quite ugly. They just end up clashing with the overall look of the game and really do not add anything to it. If anything, they're a bit more of a detriment than anything else. Luckily, the sound design doesn't fall into the same category of detriments. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but it is better than a lot of other games out there where gun sounds are surprisingly beefy, although they do sound a bit odd here and there. Environmental sounds do their job pretty well, and of course the sounds as you're running along and jumping on things are also quite good. It's the other elements of the sound design that are a bit iffier. For example, the voice acting is bland. It's not bad, it's just not very interesting. Now, admittedly, a lot of that is the script, but there is some degree of it in the voice acting itself as well. Some of the inflections are a bit odd, some of the lines come across with a bit too much of a monotone, things like that. It's never anything that's really a deal breaker, but it's certainly annoying when it comes up. But the real problem is that the lines themselves are just so incredibly bland and uninteresting that even if the actors did a fantastic job with them, you still wouldn't care. But then you move over into the music and you find that the game actually has a fairly solid soundtrack, it's just that it tends to fade into the background more often than not. It's a mixture of electronic and piano, and it actually works out rather well for the game in the long run. It's just, like I said, it fades into the background and you barely hear it over what you're doing. Which is actually a bit of a shame because, like I said, the music is fairly good and it's actually relatively unique. So when you bring all that together, the game looked and sounded pretty great when it came out, and to this day, it still holds up. But even if the presentation still holds up, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place in what seems at first like a utopia, where there's basically no crime and pretty much everybody is comfortable, except that you find out pretty quickly that that's because everything is run by an extremely totalitarian regime. Everything is monitored, they control the media, and of course they suppress any dissent swiftly and very violently. And you're tossed into this setting as Faith Connors, who is a runner. Runners are people who are basically couriers who live outside of the law. They utilize their parkour skills in order to deliver things that the various groups that hire them don't necessarily want the totalitarian regime to know about. The thing is, beyond basically an intro segment, they don't really utilize that very much. It's really more of an excuse for why Faith is so good at parkour. Now, I don't want to spoil too much of the plot for you here, but there really isn't all that much to spoil. The plot is actually quite thin and starts off when Faith finds out her sister Kate is being framed for murder. It goes from there into things that just get all over the place and just seem like a convenient excuse to have certain set pieces as well as various parkour elements. You can very easily tell that they went aesthetics first and making sense of the story second, because the story barely even makes any sense at all, and really it all just serves as convenient excuses to have you doing the various things that you're doing throughout the course of the game. So what does this end up facilitating? Well, the entire game is about parkour. You may also know that by the term free running. The idea is that you use whatever means you can in order to successfully navigate an area. But the thing is, you have to do it in ways that are completely non-conventional. So instead of, just walking around on the street level, you would run around on rooftops, you would jump across rooftops, you'd leap over fences, you would slide under things. You use various items as a springboard for getting to other locations that you couldn't normally get to, or you just slide up and down pipes and such. It's interesting. Well, at least it was interesting when this game came out. Since then, there have been a lot of games that have had parkour elements, so it's not exactly as fresh as it used to be. But as far as I'm aware, Mirror's Edge was the first one to really get parkour right in a first-person setting. It's not completely perfect or anything, but for the most part, the controls are pretty intuitive. You have an upward action and a downward action, and of course your basic movement. Upward actions are things like jumping, or using things as a springboard, or jumping onto a pipe to climb up it, or a ladder to climb up it, and things like that. Or you could use the downward action, which would be sliding under things, crouching, that sort of thing. You can also use the downward action to initiate a roll that when you jump from a higher location to a lower one and it would normally cause damage, you can use the roll to negate the damage entirely, as well as keep up some degree of momentum. Rule of thumb is, the faster you're moving, the better. Except when the game doesn't let you do that. You see, this movement system really shines when you're in larger open areas where you can do a lot of wall running, where you can do a lot of jumping over things very quickly. It does not, however, work very well in very confined spaces where you have to slow everything down to a crawl for a couple of minutes. That is just counterintuitive to the movement system, because it's really all about moving as quickly as possible, and those just require you to basically stop moving, look around, and find out where exactly you're supposed to jump from there. They drag the game to a screeching halt, and unfortunately there are quite a few moments where you have to do that. Similarly, the game emphasizes running away and avoiding combat entirely as much as you possibly can, and yet there are numerous moments throughout the game where it outright forces you into combat. Now, it is understandable that this was kind of a first attempt at this sort of thing, and it wasn't necessarily going to be perfect, but those moments are actually enough to drag the game down rather considerably, because it highlights one very simple fact about this game. The combat system is garbage. Your abilities basically consist of being able to disarm enemies, being able to punch or kick enemies, and also being able to shoot at them. Now, the firearms are only gained by either finding them in the world or disarming an enemy, and they slow you down very considerably when you use them. And they really feel counterintuitive to what this game is all about, which is building up speed and momentum. The melee combat itself ends up being very tedious, especially when you get to certain enemies who basically have the same abilities you do, in which case they just kind of kick your ass. Eventually you might be able to get the timings down, or eventually you might just get lucky enough to beat them, but those particular fights are just horrible. And when it comes to the other enemies that you might fight during the game, it's really more of a matter of just disarming them and then using their own tools against them, or just knocking them out. And you can very easily tell that they went for something that was mostly flash and not much substance, because you can end up doing things like this with basically 2 or 3 button presses. Now sure, that looks cool, but it's not all that fun to do. It is counterintuitive to the game's core design philosophy, which is build up momentum, build up speed, and find interesting ways to navigate the levels. It is not go here and fight everybody in your way. And the game really forces you into pretty much full-on combat scenarios toward the end of the game, which gets really frustrating really quickly. But by far, the biggest problem with the game is that there's really only one way to navigate the levels. Despite parkour really being all about finding interesting and creative ways of navigating the environment, this game is a very, very linear title. There is always one path that you go on, and that's it. And that is really emphasized with the element of the game called runner vision, where certain things are highlighted with different colors. For example, if you look around and you see something red, then you can probably jump on it or climb on it or whatever it may well be, and it's probably going to take you to where you need to go. Now keep in mind, you can turn off runner vision if you want to. I find that it actually kind of ruins the aesthetic, and the game is very clearly meant to be played with runner vision on. But if you think that makes the game way too easy, then you are certainly entitled to turn it off. The game gives you the tools to do so. But even if you do turn off runner vision, there's still only one way to navigate the levels. It completely goes against the entire philosophy of parkour, which is finding your own way through the environment, not being told exactly where to go whether you want to or not. It reduces something that should be about skill and creativity to basically being not much more than a few timed button presses. And that's really a shame, because the game had tons of potential, but unfortunately, DICE just didn't know how to make it. They put too much emphasis on linearity and combat. Combat probably shouldn't even be in this game at all. It should really focus entirely on the parkour. The levels should be more open-ended. You should be given plenty of options to be able to navigate the environment rather than just being like, hey, here's your path, go. And it's a real shame, because when the game is working properly, it actually is pretty interesting. It's just that the game doesn't necessarily work properly all the time, because occasionally, not all that often, but occasionally you will run into issues where you'll press a button and it doesn't necessarily do what you want it to do. For example, you try to slide and instead of sliding, it crouches. Or if you try to jump, it just kind of does a hop instead of what you wanted to do, which was jump off of something else. But thankfully those issues are infrequent enough that they're not that big of a problem. But no, the real problem with this game is that it tells you outright that it's all about building up speed, momentum, and being very creative with the way you navigate the environments, and then at nearly every turn it just prevents you from doing that. And that's both frustrating and what ultimately drags this thing down to a 2 out of 5. It was certainly a really interesting idea, but the execution just wasn't there. There was plenty of room for a sequel that could have fixed the issues that the base game had and improved what it did well. But unfortunately, this thing didn't really get a sequel so much as it got completely rebooted about 8 years later. But that's a topic for another video. Thanks for watching.